Welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you find yourselves. So this is the fourth event in our series that's running through until next March, and that presents findings from the research being conducted under the Global Integrity Anti-Corruption Evidence Programme. And today I'm delighted to welcome Gerhard Anders, Senior Lecturer in African Studies and International Development at the University of Edinburgh. And Gerhard will be talking about his project on fighting high-level corruption in Africa with a direct focus on law enforcement. Now, before I hand over to Gerhard, I will just say a very few quick words about the ACE programme and the core principles that underpin it. So the founding principles of ACE are that research should focus on anti-corruption and not just explore how corruption operates or the damage that it does. It should be problem and issue driven rather than offering generic one-size-fits-all anti-corruption solutions. It should address real-world priorities in specific sectors. It should take politics seriously and target politically viable reforms. It should, so far as possible, try to measure the real impact and effects of anti-corruption interventions, and it should engage policymakers and practitioners from nose to tail of the research process. So following on from the previous presentation in this series, which was by Jackie Harvey, and it focused on a real world priority in relation to tracing beneficial ownership in Nigeria, today's event is focused on not just the reality of law enforcement efforts in Nigeria and in Malawi, but on what can be done in a practical sense to help improve the legal prosecution of high-level corruption in those two countries. So Gerhard's work therefore speaks to the principle of taking politics seriously and developing politically viable reforms. So when Gerhard has finished his presentation, I'll then hand over to Mbeka, who's our comms lead at GIACE, and she will moderate the discussion. But do please feel free to raise questions in the chat at any point during the discussion, or to put your hand up using the Zoom function, and then Mbeka will be able to take account of any points raised. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Gerhard.
Thanks very much, Paul, for this introduction. Well, I'm conscious of the limitation on time, so I want to keep the presentation to the main findings that apply to both of the countries where we did the research, and the key recommendations. So first of all, the problem statement. What is the problem that this project addresses? First of all, there is only limited knowledge or evidence about the efficiency of law enforcement efforts against high-level corruption in Africa. So this speaks to the very title of the program. There is a lack of robust evidence, and our project has produced quite a substantial body of evidence on law enforcement against high-level corruption. High-level corruption we use as a kind of loose term to differentiate it from petty corruption. It denotes highly centralized, usually with political connections and involving large sums of money. Of course, that could differ in terms of the setting than what is considered to be a large sum of money. The other problem that the project addresses is that African law enforcement generally appears to be ineffective, haphazard, and prone to external influence. And reforms that address these issues are often piecemeal, compartmentalized, ad hoc, and mainly responses to external pressures such as the United Nations Convention Against Corruption or the Financial Action Task Force or the international financial institutions usually often request specific reforms or the establishment of specific agencies in donor recipient countries such as Malawi and Nigeria. So often these reforms are not as comprehensive as they should be. Let me move on to the just give you a very brief overview of what the project has been doing. It's the first systematic study of law enforcement efforts targeting high-level corruption in Africa that aims at identifying the enabling and constraining factors and conditions for effective enforcement practice. And we study law enforcement efforts in 2 countries, in Nigeria and Malawi. And I'm very happy to speak to the selection of these 2 countries in the Q&A. Of course, obviously, they're very different in many ways, but there are also many continuities and similarities. Our research really, and that speaks to a point that Paul made, takes seriously the perspectives of law enforcement officials and others at the forefront of the fight against high-level corruption to identify what works and what doesn't in Malawi's and Nigeria's socio-cultural and political setting. This is quite important, we think, and I think it's also something worth highlighting, that we are not coming with a solution, a universal solution or a solution that works elsewhere, but we are really working from bottom up to tailor-made recommendations and policy recommendations in these countries. The research findings challenge the dominant narrative that represents anti-corruption efforts in Africa as haphazard, ineffective, and prone to political influence by examining moments and even sustained periods of effective law enforcement that generate a deterrent effect. And this, of course, takes into account that definitions of effectiveness may vary. Again, this is a point worth exploring, but I don't have the time now to go into detail, but it might be something to be picked up in the Q&A as well. So this is a point I really want to highlight, very important. In spite of the representation of law enforcement agencies in Africa as being generally ineffective, not up to the task, we have found evidence of effective law enforcement, sometimes for sustained periods of time, but we do not deny the formidable challenges faced by law enforcement agencies in Malawi, Nigeria, and elsewhere in Africa. Let me move on to the main findings. Okay, here we go. First of all, the legal framework in both countries is characterized by a patchwork of statutes, legislation, resulting in discrepancies, overlap, and gaps and lack of clarity. So we have a layering of laws really dating back to the colonial period. And there have been virtually no efforts or very limited efforts to reconcile these inconsistencies, gaps, and ambiguities that have been created by this layering process over decades. And this has direct effects on prosecutions and trials. So bottom line here is, it's not that there is not enough in the legal toolkit. There's too much in the legal toolkit. And that creates a lot of friction, that creates a lot of confusion sometimes. Confusion that can be exploited, of course. Let me move on to a number of other key findings with regard to the legal framework. Plea bargaining has an important role to play in high-level corruption, as in any serious organized crime investigation. But in both countries, it's still in its infancy, and there have been promising beginnings, but there's no comprehensive and consistent approach that has been developed yet. It's a very fraught field, plea bargaining. Number 2, whistleblower protection is, I think, not up to the task and faces really significant challenges due to bureaucratic culture, lack of incentives, and the feelings of insecurity by would-be whistleblowers. Number 3, trials tend to experience significant delays due to frequent adjournments, lack of resources, and other disruptions such as strikes. For instance, in Malawi 2014, there was a 2-month strike by legal staff, clerks, court clerks, that of course obviously disrupted everything. So that's really of significant concern, because swift justice is really so key. You know, any delayed justice is justice denied. One important element here is that the length of time between the first arrest and the actual commencement is quite significant. So there seems to be something going on that investigators and prosecutors, well, investigators in this case, tend to arrest quickly and then do investigations until the trial starts much later. So obviously there's something that can be done about this, as I will explain in a minute. Let me move on to the institutional architecture. First of all, I think just a quick word about prevention. This is, of course, not about prevention. This is about punishment, about prosecution after the fact. But prevention is, of course, important because prosecution tends to be expensive, tends to be easily derailed. So prevention is really, should be at the heart of anti-corruption measures. But control systems, accounting standards, and audit procedures in both countries, Nigeria and Malawi, have gaps and experience frequent lapses. So it's kind of in jolts. There's a time when things are being more monitored, and then kind of lapses into basically non-compliance. And generally, law enforcement, as all government agencies and departments, is hampered by lack of resources and sufficiently trained staff. Lead agencies are understaffed, and the universal inadequacy of funding affects the efficacy of all relevant institutions. Further points in terms of our findings with regard to institutional architecture. The interface between investigators and prosecutors, which is really important to criminal investigations, obviously, especially of particular importance for high-level corruption prosecutions. So this interface between investigator and prosecutor is characterized by a lack of consistent cooperation and coordination. Although in Nigeria, we have found evidence that there have been steps have been made to address this. So there's a bit more, at least on paper, than in Malawi, but there's still a lot of room for improvement here with regard to this interface. So what happens basically, law enforcement agencies operate according to the common law model, where the team of investigators concludes the investigation, hands over the file, or sometimes it's referred to as a docket, to the prosecutor, and that's it. There's no further contact. So the prosecutor is then just basically left with whatever is handed to him or her. Now, this has proved problematic in complex money laundering cases, especially when the investigators have only limited familiarity with this type of offense and assembling evidence to prove it. So often the file is incomplete and doesn't really have strong evidence that gives confidence to the prosecutor in court, but there's no real mechanism to go back to the investigators and request the evidence that is missing. So I'm happy again to take questions in due course. I'm sorry, just one moment. Did I almost skipped over a very important finding here? And that is that the principal law enforcement agencies in both countries tend to operate separately, with limited strategic cooperation and only very little tactical or operational cooperation in investigations and prosecutions. Instead, the relationships between the various agencies are often typified by rivalry and competition. This is particularly striking with regard to the Anti-Corruption Bureau in Malawi, the ICPC and the EFCC in Nigeria, who have statutory independence. Now, when these agencies were established, the independence was seen as one of the key features that would shield them from influence from outside. Yet this very independence is often a problem when it comes to coordinate law enforcement efforts, as we have found in our research. Moving on quickly. Now, two more findings that I would want to highlight: external influences. One of the things that we found striking when we are working with investigators and prosecutors in Malawi and Nigeria is really the difficult environment that they are working in. It's a largely hostile and at best indifferent environment. It reminded me often of lone rangers who are fighting against the odds, really bound, one arm bound behind the back, with very little support from superiors and society at large. So that is really an issue that we took that really came through very strongly in the research. Moral values and social sanctions that compel compliance with the law of the modern state are constantly undermined by other logics, such as patron-client relationships, the logic of kinship, regionalism, the logic of dependency. For instance, oh, this is money from donors. we steal it. It's a victimless crime, for instance, just to give you a quick sort of line there. And of course, there's there are efforts by politicians, but not only politicians, actually. The directors of the law enforcement agencies said that there are so many different actors that try to influence the agencies, law enforcement officials, ranging from politicians, journalists, civil society organizations, members of the government, and so on. So the official hierarchy is really only one aspect of governance in Malawi and Nigeria, where formal and informal modes of governance have become closely intertwined since independence. Again, this could be a point we want to explore a little bit further in the Q&A. Unfortunately, I now have the feeling that I don't have enough time to go into more detail. So let me move on. How am I doing on time? I think it's not too bad. So let me move on to the recommendations, part 2 of the presentation. Now, first of all, you might recall that one of the main findings was the legal patchwork. There was a lot of discrepancies, gaps, inconsistencies, ambiguities. So what we need is a comprehensive review of the relevant legislation in both countries. This has to be led by the Ministry of Justice in Nigeria, the Federal Ministry of Justice, and the legislature. Of course, the president's support couldn't do much, should support this. There should be support from the highest level, obviously, here. So this is really an important area for review. And the important point here is it has to be a comprehensive review. And it shouldn't be like an ad hoc sort of jolty thing. Number 2, witness and whistleblower protection should be further expanded and should include witness protection and safeguarding of witnesses in criminal cases. Again, Ministry of Justice would probably have to be the lead in this one too. Reducing delays, review of the criminal procedures and evidence codes with the aim to reduce delays and exceedingly long trials. Rules of court for the management and expedition of trials are necessary for improving public confidence in the criminal justice system. Further, the length of time between the first arrest, you remember that point that I made, the length of time between first arrest and actual commencement of the trial should be reduced by concluding investigations prior to arrest. So really ending this practice of just going out, arresting someone, getting the headlines, but then not having really a complete case yet to be prosecuted. No, arrest and then prosecution straight away. Don't give time to the accused to cover their tracks. Again, Ministry of Justice, the lead here, Attorney General, Solicitor General possibly, and maybe a commission to be established, led by a judge, could do a lot of work here. And of course, let me point out that we are under no illusion that these recommendations kind of can just be followed and implemented. I mean, there's an ongoing conversation with a lot of participants from the donor community, stakeholders, researchers, universities, and so on, practitioners, policymakers. So our project is just one voice in a whole chorus of voices, and we really sought to supplement, to strengthen, to kind of amplify the message that is not unique necessarily to this. Whistleblower protection is in almost any project recommendation, but I think it is important to have a sort of like a constant reminder from various different angles. All right, let me move on to the next set of recommendations. Prosecution strategy. Well, prosecution strategy development should begin before executive action. So discussions might include all or some of the law enforcement agencies and institutions with comparable powers and duties. So really to have a coherent, comprehensive prosecution strategy for high-level corruption cases that would include financial investigations, profiling, unexplained wealth, asset tracing, and recovery. This again, all of this is actually Ministry of Justice. So the Attorney Generals are really here, the ones we are looking at, but also the anti-corruption agencies such as the EFCC, the ICPC, the ACB, and other law enforcement agencies. We should not forget the police. actually often in the anti-corruption discourse, there is a lot of emphasis on the role of anti-corruption agencies, but the police has a very important role, sometimes through financial, fiscal and fraud units, to play here. We should also mention financial intelligence authorities or units that are very important in this regard, especially when it comes to asset tracing and recovery to some extent. Asset recovery, expropriation of illicit wealth should be integrated into all forms of disciplinary and court proceedings against malefactors in both public and private sectors. This should be consistent and effective, and it should be founded on a new national economic crime strategy. And of course, all of this should also be part of national anti-corruption strategies. And I'm happy to point out that in Malawi, some of our recommendations found their way into the national anti-corruption strategy. Let me move on to resources. Yes, well, I mean, that's a kind of, can be quick about this. Yes, law enforcement agencies need to be adequately resourced. Of course, we fully understand that could be a challenge because there's other agencies and departments and functions that vie for funding. But law enforcement agencies should be adequately resourced to ensure timely proceedings. This would be the president and the legislature mainly to ensure the resourcing, the legislature, the parliament through the budget. Then interagency cooperation and cooperation within agencies has to be strengthened. Law enforcement agencies should follow the guidance on the establishment of integrated teams for investigations and prosecutions. The point that I made about the gap or the interface between investigators and prosecutors. And it is really FATF recommendations to create these integrated teams of investigators and prosecutors. It could be teams that are not prosecutor-led because you want to keep the investigators on board, but they could be prosecutor-guided or with advice from prosecutors, but to make sure that all the evidence is there for the prosecutor to have a strong case in court. Moving on to the, sorry, bear with me, this is not working. Oh, sorry, there was a slight delay. The last three recommendations is regarding political or external influence. It's very important to have transparent appointment procedures that are based exclusively on merit, performance, and potential, robust vetting procedures, rules for nominations and appointments, and enforcement of regulations regarding dismissals and suspensions from service. This is a point of particular importance. Often presidents like to go in and say, you are fired. Sort of the strong man kind of showing his power. And I think it's very important that officials are in some ways protected from these ad hoc interventions. The role of international development partners, the only thing we can say here is coordination, coordination, and coordination. The various development partners, whether they are bilateral or multilateral, and of course, this has been recognized for almost 20 years, but they're still, it's still found wanting in many respects. So it's just important that there is this inter-donor conversation to ensure that support is targeted, that support is coordinated, that there are not redundancies. And just very briefly, because it's such an important point, donors often, as in our report, point out that there's little coordination between, government agencies in a recipient country. The same is applicable to the donors themselves. There's little coordination between the donors in any given country. And last but not least, it cannot be overstated how important a free press, media, and active civil society are for the effective law enforcement. And law enforcement agencies should really reach out to civil society, should reach out, should have media strategies, should have communication strategies. Of course, they do to some extent, but I think that can be much more further developed to have a proactive engagement with media, with the civil society, to explain what the agencies are doing, to explain how the law works so that people understand, for instance, plea bargaining and would not call only for harsh sentencing, but would understand better the rationale behind decisions taken by law enforcement agencies. I think that's it. Thanks very much for your attention. And I hope there are some points that merit further exploration in the Q&A. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Gerhard. It's always really nice to hear all the work that you're doing and see kind of how it evolved. I'm going to sort of jump in here, but I'm hoping that this intimate group of participants, if any of you have any questions, please either get off mic and get off your camera. You can just ask them, or unmute, or you can put them in the chat. What I really wanted to talk about was your recent trip and the recent workshop. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you configured out the goals and objectives of that, and really what the response was like. I just wanted to update everybody about like the work that you just finished doing.
All right, yeah, thanks, Ambika. Yeah, so last week we had a workshop for stakeholders in Lilongwe in Malawi, and we were very happy to be joined by the Director of Public Prosecutions, Dr. Kayuni, the Chairman of the Malawi Electoral Commission, Dr. Kachale, who is also a High Court judge in the criminal division, and there were other stakeholders present. Of course, the British High Commission and FCDO were there, the Norwegian Embassy, the USAID was there. And the presentation was an extended sort of version of what I just talked about. And I think, again, I just want to highlight this point is that basically there's not a week that passes without at least one, maybe two anti-corruption workshops. And I think it is important to be aware of that and to see how you can amplify useful recommendations, how you can sort of enhance the impact of the research rather than try to sort of carve out your own niche. So we really made a conscious effort in reaching out to development partners, to other researchers, of course, also researchers in the Global Integrity and Anti-Corruption Evidence Program, sort of trying to have that sort of extra effect, because there's no shortage of evidence, but the question is sort of how do we get it across? How do we convey it? And I think one of the main points, and then we can move on to the next point, but one of the main points that was made by the practitioners is that they really appreciated the opportunity to approach this from the perspective of what is working, because there are certain things that are working in law enforcement, not denying that there are problems or challenges. And I think that really opens up the conversation. If you are a law enforcement official in Malawi, for instance, you get generally hit over the head, you know, nothing is working, it's not good enough. So I think this was really important to have this positive element and to emphasize that and to work with that. Yes, thanks. I think that was
I think Johannes had a question, but I just wanted to ask a follow-up before he asks his question. So these anti-corruption workshops, and you were saying, and I know you're making a few jokes about how they happen all the time. Why a workshop? Like why are people holding so many anti-corruption workshops?
I mean, it's just, you know, I mean, if you just look at the international landscape, so you have, since you have UNODC, you have EU, you have FCDO, you have USAID, you have GIZ, just to mention some of the major ones. You have UNDP, you have the World Bank, you have the International Monetary Fund to some extent, and of course, anti-corruption and governance is kind of on the radar of all of those, because it's part, as I said, of an ongoing conversation that is much wider, you know, where GIAs is one element in that, right? You went to OECD, I think Paul and Johannes at some point, and other conferences. So there's a lot going on, and I think it's really important to show awareness of that and to have understanding also. I mean, I think if you are an official, that's the Director of Public Prosecutions, you can spend every day basically on a workshop, but you need to do your job. So there were a few people who couldn't come and who said, well, I have a work actually need to do. And we said, of course, I mean, your work is so much more important than any workshop you can attend, because again, people already know what they need to do, and people, more importantly, also know what they can do in the circumstances that they are in. And I think it's just for us, our role was really to just sort of echo, to provide, you know, a sort of sounding board for that, to show, you know, it's so important what you do, and you do good stuff too. You know, it's not all just not enough. And I thought that was really appreciated, both in Nigeria and Malawi. We had an earlier event with the new chairman of the EFCC, Chairman Bawa, which was also quite illuminating in terms of, how they approach things. Sorry, I took too long. I'm not sure. Yeah, there was
I'll
Johannes.
follow up with that in a second, but I'll ask Johannes to jump in with this question.
Great, thank you so much, Gerhard. Exciting research, and I personally am a huge fan of this entire approach to really, ask what counts as effective from a country perspective. And I think the findings and recommendations that you have produced are likewise both intuitive, and it is great that those are based on evidence and the research that you have done. My question is, and I'm not sure if there's a clear answer to that, so I'm asking more about your thoughts and your experience, is about both sequencing and prioritization of those recommendations and findings that you have. And also a question about who you think is the most likely entity to take the lead in prioritizing or sequencing any of those recommendations. Because to me, at least as an outsider, it looks like, all these are good recommendations, but how to sort of take next steps and practically implement one after the other or support those actors, whether it's through external resources or through internal processes, to say, how do you go about sort of setting out a action plan to prioritize one over the other, sequence one after the other. So I wonder if you have thoughts, or whether in your workshops you have heard actors think about that out loud.
Yes, I mean, first of all, both in Nigeria and Malawi, even though Nigeria is so much more bigger and this is so much more, just in terms of the size, the people, the demographics, all of that, Malawi is a small operation, but regardless of the size, it is often very individual, actually. So I've been working with some individuals for years, even predating this current generation of the GIA. So I think that's one level of engagement, is just sort of really a long-term engagement that has various dimensions and aspects, and that I think gave us a sort of rapport and access. So there is a certain receptiveness, but of course people get transferred, people get demoted, people get promoted. So that is a challenge. And of course, you like to talk about institutions or agencies, but it is often individuals. And I think the other point that we need to take into account, and that's where you come, your question about, so who should lead this, or where should we start with this? So number one is there is a receptive audience, if you like. There are people that we have been working with for a long time in various kind of roles. So we know how to find them. They know that we are, making sense, and there's receptiveness, but they're working within constraints of a very hierarchical system, number one, and of course of the political economy in the respective countries. So what is possible, basically? So that is number two. So it has to be led from the very highest level, which in our case is always the head of the Ministry of Justice, which would be the Attorney General. So that person has to be on board, and he is with regard to Malawi, with regard to Nigeria. It's so much more bigger. I mean, we are such a small player in Nigeria, really. But nevertheless, we have met the important people. But again, that's where what I was talking about with the sort of chorus. It's a chorus with many different voices. And lots of these voices are connected with each other through GIAs, for instance. So you'll hear something about beneficial ownership from Jackie. You'll hear something from law enforcement from our side, asset recovery. So, all of these kind of fit together with other voices then in the general discussion. So yeah, I mean, these are hierarchical organizations. So there has to be leadership from usually the Attorney General. So again, this is individual, people there's an election, there's a new Attorney General. So yes, that can be an opportunity too sometimes, right? So the current Attorney General, for instance, was very new in the job in Malawi. That's a very promising development, for instance. Not sure that answers the question. So yes, so it's two levels. Number one, deep engagement, long-term engagement. Number two, it has to come from the very top. So with help usually amplified through, for instance, the British High Commission, FCDO, the American Embassy, GIZ, even the EU. Yes.
I see Paul has a hand up. I just wanted to follow up on that and ask about the police. And you were talking about the importance of reaching out to the police. When you do these workshops, or when you're talking about the stuff that, in terms of prioritization, the hierarchy, how have you found it to be, how have you included them in the process, or what are sort of the obstacles around that?
Oh yeah, there's a question also from Henry. So I just want to let you know that I saw that. So we will come back to that. Yeah, and thanks. There are the policy briefs, the working papers where we have much more detailed information on all of this. So yeah, the police is actually a challenge because the police is number one. It's like at the heart of the sovereign, like state apparatus, government. It's firmly embedded and really at the center of like sovereign state bureaucracy. So how you approach them is very difficult because you can't just sort of call, like a detective or someone and, come over to our workshop. It's much easier if you're working with EFCC, ICPC in Nigeria, or ACP in Malawi, because these are much smaller. Even in Nigeria, they are much smaller organizations. So, you easily can find there's a contact. They often have been set up with donor money, actually. So they are often geared towards engaging outside actors, whereas the police usually is kind of at a distance there. So yeah, I mean, I don't have really an answer, because that workshop last week, unfortunately, no one from the police was there, because the individual that we work with wasn't any longer in the post. And so yeah, so yes, police is a challenge, and that's why I think a lot of the anti-corruption interventions are kind of tilted, lopsided towards these specialized agencies, and we shouldn't forget, at least, about the police.
No, I think that's really helpful. Let me take Paul's question, then we can move on to Henry's.
Thanks very much. So I want to just pick up a bit on the exchange you had with Johannes around his question. Because clearly, if you focus on high level corruption, as you are looking at, the people that most likely benefit from that type of corruption are precisely the people who are in positions of power and able to extract rents, get benefit from abusing that power, which then raises the obvious question of, well, why would they lead the moves against their own interests, as it were? So, what would be the incentives? Now, clearly, part of the answer to that is about finding appropriate windows of opportunity for change. And you mentioned, elections are a potential point at which you can get some inflection. Malawi, recent change of government, possibly a case in point. But evidence would suggest from much of the area that we're looking at, of a number of regimes where corruption is pretty much embedded, where in a sense it's the kind of the modus operandi. So that when you do get those changes, what tends to happen very quickly is that the incoming government basically takes the position of, it's our turn now. So, having spoken, perhaps the good talk about tackling corruption, once they get into a position where they can do something about it, the incentive to actually benefit is greater than the incentive to actually do something about it. So do you have any thoughts about how you can maintain the commitment to being genuinely against corruption, even when in power, when the incentives not to do anything become much, much stronger?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I mean, it's a absolutely valid point. I mean, I think the change that is affected by elections is an important element in disrupting corrupt networks, in enabling prosecution. That's what our research in Nigeria also has shown. It can also sometimes disrupt actually effective law enforcement, because a new government comes in and they move people who have been doing a very good job. So that can happen too. I guess even in a small place such as Malawi, and even though the elite is tightly knit, there are still differences and there are still people. So I think, I mean, if you have, completely hypothetically speaking, an attorney general who is not interested in this, it will not happen in law enforcement, right? But there's also a very strong professional ethos in the legal profession generally in Africa and in really all parts of Africa. So there's a sort of strong sense of, you know, being maybe a legal practitioner. So if you're looking at the Ministry of Justice, and they are not always looking eye to eye, you know, to people maybe in the Ministry of Mines or, you know, the National Oil Commission, and are often appalled by what is going on there. So I think what we found is there are individuals, that's what I meant, they are working often in a hostile environment. So these might be just a few people who try to make a difference against all odds. So even though it is pervasive, there are different networks at play. So if we just take the example of Malawi, where we had a massive corruption scandal in 2013, which was linked or allegedly linked to the then president, has not been proven in court, I have to point out. You know, and not everybody is part of that. So even in the government, even among ministers, there are different ones. So I think if you have a AG and Attorney General who really wants to do something, and then he teams up with an Inspector General who kind of lends his support, I mean, then you would have a very strong team. If you have, you know, a Director of Public Prosecutions, but no one else, it's still a strong team, but not quite as strong as the other team. So there would be degrees. So I think you have a valid point, but I think there is still, there are still sort of pockets of effectiveness, even in the most challenging environment.
Thank you. So Henry's question was about suggesting a practical whistleblowing protection measure that can be implemented in Nigeria based on the research you and Nick have been doing.
Yeah, that is interesting. Yeah, thanks Henry for the question. Now, whistleblower protection, it's a real sort of, you know, a mainstay of all recommendations. It's always found to be wanting. It's never kind of good enough. And I think one of the problems is even the best whistleblower protection does not necessarily make a witness protection. So witness protection is really a big problem, a big challenge in both countries. So that leads me to another problem, which is the bureaucratic culture. In a whistleblower in any setting is generally regarded as like a traitor, someone who is, you know, sort of breaking the mold. So I think especially in the bureaucracies in Malawi, more so than in Nigeria, you know, there's a strong sense of loyalty, and it's very, very difficult to challenge that. But there are people who have a high level of integrity. So what they are doing is they are leaking usually information to the media or to civil society. So you can see by the amount of leaking of information, which is made easier with social media, WhatsApp, and, you know, you can take pictures of all kinds of, you know, tenders and procurement stuff. You can see that there are a lot of officials who would feel very uneasy about corruption. So they are trying to do something which they think they can do with less risk to themselves. But very few, kind of virtually no one, goes the whistleblower route. So I think one way to do it would be to really create a whistleblower system that leads to witness in court. That's one thing. So if you have a clear, that's I think often missed. A whistleblower is not necessarily a witness. So you need someone in a witness protection program. So what you need is a witness protection program, actually, that sees you through, that gives you maybe a new identity or so. Now, how to do that would be, I think, very, very difficult, because at least in Malawi, everybody knows everybody. So you would be like 2 days, you would be actually a witness protected. In Nigeria, it could take a little longer because it's a very big place. So that is a real problem. But I think what you could do is to be serious about it and to have at least a witness protection program that is worth the name. And then once you can see that these witnesses come forward in trials, you know, and then, you know, are maybe moved to another city or another region, get a reward in a way that for what they do. I think that could go a long way. A reward as in, you organize a new job, maybe a better job, you get promoted. In Nigeria now, you are a whistleblower, you get demoted. You have to be a whistleblower, you should be promoted. So that is again going to the very top of the ministries that have to implement it at the Federal Ministry of Justice. But yeah, that is to me the key. There should be a proper reward, and the protection is almost impossible, but at least a proper reward.
No, I really appreciate that recommendation. Johannes, do you want to, or Sky or Johannes, would you guys like to say anything?
Yeah, no, no problem, Sky. Much appreciated. I understand you have other work to do.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
That was very, very apropos.
Isn't that the nightmare in an online meeting? Like you're basically, all of a sudden you're called upon and you think, oh my God, now I have to say something.
Yeah.
Paul.
I think Paul, did you have another question, or was that just a legacy hand?
That's just my incompetence, which you would thought by now I'd know how to take my hand down. I'll do it.
Yeah, I have so many things I want to ask you, so I can keep going. But so the work that you and Nick are doing with Nigeria and Malawi, and just what you were saying with Nigeria being such a big field, with all of this work and this stuff here, why did you pair them specifically? And also what was the tricky parts and the easy parts of that collaboration for other people looking to collaborate across the continent?
Sure. I mean, I think Nigeria and Malawi, we selected because both show that have law enforcement efforts that have been effective to some extent. Now, of course, especially in Nigeria, corruption is still rampant, but what we were picking up on was that there are also really serious efforts to do something about it. So that's number one. So in both countries, we have seen sustained law enforcement efforts targeting high-level corruption. Of course, not without its problems, I should, of course, point out. And we thought it would be interesting to have a regional element to this. So we have West Africa and we have Eastern Africa. So that is number one. That would be one aspect that we found interesting. So it's about the differences really, and to have a comparison between these two in terms of scale, in terms of size. I mean, I think that's where Nigeria, when we were working there with the law enforcement agencies, I mean, it's because it's a big country. There's much more competition. It's like Switzerland and the US, in Switzerland, in the Ministry of Justice, everybody knows everybody probably. And the US is such a big place that you would have different groups within, and that's the same in Nigeria. So even we were very impressed by our partners in the ICPC and the EFCC and the Code of Conduct Bureau in the Office of the President. Very, very impressive work. So I think we were interested in the differences, but I think a lot of the issues cut across. And of course, we should also point out, just one final point on this, is that high-level corruption then is relative. Now in Malawi, $20 million is huge. In Nigeria, $20 million is, barely worth mentioning. So that's where high-level corruption is very case or setting specific. But a lot of the issues we found really cut across, such as interagency rivalry, lack of coordination, the need to improve the interface between investigators and prosecutors, attempts to influence officials, the need to strengthen asset recovery. So all of these, I think, would cut across. Yes, the Francophone countries would be very, very interesting. I mean, that's, I think, one other element. These are both countries that are former British colonies, and they have, they retain the colonial legal system in a post-colonial sort of manifestation. Francophone countries, very, very interesting. And the previous research that I did was covering Francophone countries, which was on petty corruption. So that would be definitely something very interesting. And I think what we would see, just a word on that, where we see the layering. So because I think as far as anti-corruption agencies, as they have been established since the late 1990s, early 2000s, we would find them in any country, both Francophone and Anglophone. But the legislation would be very, very different. The criminal law would be very different. So that would be definitely an interesting avenue to pursue.
That's a really interesting point. And I don't know if you have anything more to add or questions around that, but Paul has a real hand up.
Yeah, no, and it actually picks up on precisely that, which is, I was going to refer to your previous work under the Anti-Corruption Evidence Programme, which did look at Francophone and Anglophone countries, but with a specific focus on what you call practical norms, which is strong parallels with the work that Claudia Baez Camargo has done on informal governance and the importance of social norms. I just wanted you to comment, because in a sense, the kinds of recommendations that you've set out in terms of, well, what needs to be done in Malawi and Nigeria sort of presuppose, formal governance, whereas your previous work has really emphasized the importance of understanding and appreciating the lack of formal governance as being a key driver of why corruption takes place. Now, I understand that previously you were looking at petty corruption, and this time you're looking at grand corruption, but it still remains the case that what you don't have in these settings are the kind of match between the formal governance and how governance is actually conducted on the ground and in real life. So might you just comment on that?
Oh yeah, thanks, Paul. That's an excellent point. Now, the previous research, without going into detail, was really, as you say, looking at informality, at practices at shop floor level in health and education, government institutions. So it was including corrupt practices. And there we found informality to play a very important role. Now, informality is a very difficult term, actually. So that was one of the problems, because how do you define informality as opposed to formality? That's not always easy in these regards, because it's actually a very hybrid thing going on that we were exploring in the research. And I think, well, anyway, so come to that in a moment. So that's the previous research. Now, with this research, now we are focusing on anti-corruption really much more explicitly. So on the agencies that target high-level corruption in our case. And I think this reflects or speaks to a sort of broader development or a shift actually in scholarship on Africa in general, on governance in Africa, which for a long time has emphasized informal, the politics of the belly, the nepotistic kinship ties, the ethnicity. And in the last 5 years or so, there has been really a movement that actually recognizes the importance of formal institutions. So a lot of this research has been focused on elections and parliaments, but of course it extends to other formal institutions, such as, for instance, criminal justice system. That's what we do. So I think there's generally a sort of revisionist moment maybe that says, yes, informality, of course, we have studied this and it is important, but maybe have we not underestimated the impact of the formal institutions actually. So that's in terms of the academic debate where our research kind of makes a contribution to. So I think it's also in terms of, and of course, obviously, there are other projects who are trying to do this, but personally, I find it's quite difficult actually to make a translation from a research project on informality, whatever it is, say everyday practices on the shop floor level in clinics, to recommendations. I think is actually much more difficult than formulating recommendations for the Attorney General, because the Attorney General knows exactly then what to do and has the authority to do it. But how do you change behavior in a ward, in a rural clinic? But of course, obviously, that's fortunately not my task. And I think Claudia has been doing a very good job in achieving that. But I think it is a pretty tall order sometimes.
Yeah, that just leads me to my next question, specifically with the workshop, but also just in general. One of the things you always talk about with the challenges of your work, right, is like always the moving parts with the politics, and how that makes it really difficult because of the relationships. I'm curious, for the people who you've had continuous relationships with, where it hasn't constantly changed, what's been the biggest pushback towards making some of those recommendations a reality?
It's just the sheer scale, you know, I mean, this, because you need to get, say, the Parliamentary Legal Affairs Committee, you get the very top of the Ministry of Justice. At least the president has to say, yeah, this sounds good, let's do this. So, I mean, we are talking about the highest level of government that have a lot of other stuff going on. And I think it might be important to us, but for them, you know, other issues might be much more important that are sometimes linked. So for instance, in Malawi, there was, of course, the contested election and then the rerun of the election. So that occupied people. And so I guess the problem is, if you ask me point blank, is there's so much going on, and all of that is so incredibly important for, you know, functioning public services and accountable governance, that it just basically sort of sometimes is eclipsed by other issues. And I think that's one of the reasons that we saw why the trials are sometimes so challenging. If you have a criminal trial that goes on for 5 years, you know, in the meantime, a lot of stuff happens. You know, you live in a setting with very limited resources, and it gets derailed, and the little that there is in terms of resources is kind of getting directed to another issue. So that's the main issue, I think, is just the sheer scale of challenges across a really broad range of issues. So if corruption would be the only one, it could be fixed, but there's like 5 other ones that are as important or sometimes even more important. You know, that I think is the main challenge, of course. And that brings us full circle to where the thing started, corruption, right? Which is, it has a real effect for people on the street, for patients in hospitals, for citizens who face poverty, who have not enough education access, who don't have jobs, who have to pay bribes. So all of these are interlinked, but that's exactly the problem. They are all interlinked, they're all important, and that is the problem.
I think we're at the hour. There's some really nice comments about the relevance to some of the South African work as well. You can always reach out to us at Global Integrity or sign up for our newsletter, and reach out to Gerhard as well if you want to follow up with some of the stuff on South Africa. I did want to say we will be skipping next week because we have a very big event on the 8th. Johannes, I don't know if you want to just briefly talk about the Global Integrity SOAS event on the 8th.
Yeah, I can do that. So next week on December 8th, and I'm not entirely sure about the time. That's 9:30 a.m. Eastern. We'll host a joint event with SOAS, University of London, and the Open Government Partnership on the issue of how we might think about locally led approaches to figuring out corruption issues and responding with effective anti-corruption measures. And that's an event that takes place under the umbrella of the Summit for Democracy. So it is meant to be a contribution to this question of how we can foster and bolster local efforts to really chime in and make a difference in our joint anti-corruption work. So, you know, find the link, I think, in the chat. That's right. But although it's on the 8th, not the 9th. Yeah, join us.